welcome back to class. I'm in Dallas, Texas, and this image is the Parthenon in ancient Greece. It's telling of what's going on in Texas over the last week, the snow and the ice and everything. Of course, they're rebuilding the Parthenon, which was destroyed many years ago, I think in the 1700s, is that there was gunpowder stored in the Parthenon that exploded during one of the wars. And so I think they're restoring it. But for the most part, this picture shows the current state of Texas over the last 5 days. I just thought this was a beautiful image of the scaffolding around the Parthenon and, of course, the snow and the trees. So this class is really based on what's called syntax of classical architecture, and syntax means a grammar of the language, the way the parts are organized. And let me see if I can. Yeah, so syntax and related classical elements we talked about. For those of you that are new to the class, I'm going to kind of give you a brief overview, but we're going to roughly be talking about intercolumnation spacing, the syntax, the grammar of the orders, the way the columns relate to a wall surface. There's several different I call them characters, architects: Vitruvius, Sebastian Serlio, and prominently Andrea Palladio.
But one of them wouldn't come back on, one of the GFI. So he's not.
What? I'm sorry. Do what now?
Oh, all good.
Okay.
Someone on unmute.
And also, I think those of you that have a sketchbook or notebook, you can write these down. I'm happy to kind of go back. There's a lot of information to cover, but there's really three main architects: Vitruvius, the first century architect, Sebastian Serlio, and then Andrea Palladio. Those are two Renaissance architects. Then we have the first century architect Vitruvius. First, we're going to talk about the rules. There's several different rules in classical architecture that really should not be broken. The relationship of the entablatures, relationship with the orders, the columnar spacing, Greek versus Roman terminology in architecture. Learning outcomes, we talked about the syntax. We mentioned this earlier. I'm going to show you several different images of Vitruvius's ideas versus Sebastian Serlio and Andrea Palladio's architecture. And if I'm going too fast, please turn your microphones on. I can go back and replay some of the videos. Okay, so Vitruvius was really the first century architect. And when we talk about first century architecture, we're talking about Hadrian's Villa, the Pantheon in Rome, Diocletian's palace. He's really the one that created what's called intercolumnation spacing, which means the spacing roughly in Greek architecture, which means, we'll talk about that in a minute, is like the way that the columns are spaced between what's called the architrave above that, as well as many other things. So those of you that are new to the class, these are some 5 basic orders that Sebastian Serlio, the Renaissance architect, sort of codified. And codified, he means he actually classified all the 5 orders. There's really 5. Originally in the Greek architecture, there's 3. We've seen Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. But then the Roman and Renaissance, he introduced Tuscan and composite. So Sebastian Serlio was the Renaissance architect that grouped all these 5 orders into 5 basic classical types. I'm showing that because there's several people that are new to this class, and so I just want to make sure that there's a lot of people think that there's 3 orders, of course, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, but there's really 5: Tuscan from the Etruscan temple, and then the composite order introduced into the Renaissance later. Some key things to remember. Let's look at the Doric order. What we're going to talk about is the triglyphs and the metopes in the frieze. You can see, can you guys see my cursor? I thank you. Okay, so for the most part, when you analyze and look at the classical orders, really the triglyphs and the metopes, which we'll look at in a minute, are really evident in the Doric order. So pretty much you will not see triglyphs and metopes in Ionic and Corinthian classical orders. They're really evident in the Doric order. Hold on just a moment. You know, I live in downtown, there's a lot of noise and ambulance. But for the most part, when you look at the classical orders, you're really going to be seeing the triglyphs and metopes in the Doric order, not Corinthian and Ionic. Okay, we'll look at this one in a minute. So for the most part, let's take a look at intercolumnation spacing. What on earth does that mean? What you're looking at is the relationship of the columns and the spacing in between each column. What I'm going to show you is that, you know, Greek architecture really couldn't span that far because, of course, they're using stone and marble for the beams above the columns. So there's different sort of terminology based on how many columns space. If you look at the bottom right, which says Roman Ionic intercolumnation, you can see that the terminology is based on the number of diameters, or of course, the spacing of the triglyphs in between each column. If you look at the top right-hand diagram, there's like, you know, it's called monotriglyphs. There's one triglyph in between each column. There's two triglyphs, 3, 4, 5. Again, what I was saying earlier is that you wouldn't see the triglyphs, of course, are the 3 stone parts that stylize the wooden temple that shows the beam in the cross section on the frieze. Of course, you won't see that in Ionic or Corinthian, but for the most part, there is a specific way that the columns are spaced based on the spacing, the diameter of columns, and of course, the triglyphs and the metopes, which I'll get into a little bit more information. This is really interesting because, you know, in Greek architecture, you know, that there's a specific ratio about the way the columns are spaced based on the number of columns, the diameter, and of course, the spacing in the triglyphs and the metopes, which we'll get into a little bit more specifically. But for the most part, I'm going to show you several rules in classical architecture that really shouldn't be violated. There's one rule when you're as an active observer in architecture, you really need to understand that the column and the entablature, which is here, the frieze and the architrave, is always aligned with the neck of the column. Which means, in other words, if you see a lot of modern classical buildings, they're not really understanding the relationship of the edge of the frieze and architrave relative to the neck of the column. These all have to be carefully aligned with each other. You can see the frieze and architrave share the same alignment with the neck of the column. That is a very standard rule that should never be violated between each one of the orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Another rule is you always have to have an even number of columns and an odd number of spacing. So this is part of the fragments of the the Parthenon in Greece. There's 8 columns, and then there is an odd number of spacing because you would never have a column at the center of the building. And by that, I mean is that you would always have an even number of columns and an odd number of spacing. So prominently, you would have a triglyph at the center of the central opening. You would never have a column. You would only violate that relationship in postmodern architecture in the 60s, predominantly established by Robert and Denise Venturi, is that their Complexity and Contradiction book has these deliberately puns and inflections on classical architecture. But for the most part, for classical architecture, you would always have an even number of columns and an odd number of spacing. So here is the main facade in Athens. You still have an even number of columns and, of course, an odd number of spacing. So when we look at the Doric order, what I was saying is that there's some special relationships, is that the metope, which of course is the space between the triglyph and the other columns that it's always a square. This is always a square proportion. So the width of the triglyphs, of course, it's called triglyph because there's 3 wooden beams that are stylized in stone and marble. You can see the 3 beams that are stylized, which is based on the diameter of the column. We talked about earlier in some of the classes is that every little part of this is based on the dimension of the column. So the metope is the central spandrel, which is predominantly a square, and of course the triglyph can be proportioned and adjusted based on the width of the spacing of the columns. Okay, so this is a reconstruction of, this is the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. I think you can see that. This is actually reconstructed with poured in place concrete. Of course, it doesn't really have the magic of the Acropolis because there's no hillside, but you can see the entire scale of the building is reproduced based on the number of the exact proportions that were originally recreated. Okay, so we talk about Greek space and structure versus Roman space. Earlier, I talked about the language of the columnar spacing, the intercolumnation spacing between the columns, and of course what's called the architrave above that. I'll show that to you in a minute. But again, Greek space, we're not really able to span that far because we're not building with arches. We're building with stone and wood. So of course, the span of Greek architecture is really not that far apart because we're not structurally able to span that far. And if you think about this, this is a wonderful drawing showing the Grecian space and structure based on the limitations of the stone material above what's called, I'm going to show you an image of what's called the architrave, the beam above that spans the space between the columns. So in Greek architecture, you have to have an infinite number of columns to structurally span the stone and marble above that. So some terminology is called the architrave. I've mentioned this before, but it's important to know in each class, is that it's the chief being, you know, architecture is the highest art form, space, form, light, order. Architrave, the prefix arch is the chief, the most important, the highest. So when we talk about the architrave, it's really this member, the beam underneath what I'm calling the triglyphs and the metopes. It's the main structural member. Architrave is the chief beam that spans between one column and another one. So when we look at this, when you look at all the Greek and Roman temples, they're articulating the architrave. Of course, the spandrel, the lintel, the header, those are all interchangeable. The architrave, the main beam that spans, of course, between each column. It's very different between Greek architecture and Roman architecture. Now, the image on the left is, of course, the wooden Etruscan temple, a very primitive temple, several hundred years after the primitive hut that was established. But we're looking at on the right is the Greek and Roman temple, because of course they're stylizing the wooden structure as stone and marble in, of course, the ancient Greek and Roman temples. But we still are seeing the architrave, the chief beam that spans between the columns. Okay, that's really Greek architecture. When we get into Roman architecture, it's quite a bit different because now we're building with Roman arches. Of course, Greeks were not building with arches because they didn't have the technology. Really, the first arches in architecture were the aqueducts, which of course had brick and masonry arches poured with concrete. So now the material changed the structural dynamics altogether. So this is definitely not built with brick and masonry and concrete. This is simply stone, possibly wood and marble. So the Romans created larger spans, of course, using the arch construction. And these are very important terminology to understand in architecture. And I hope you're writing these down in your sketchbook or notebook. But for the most part, the individual pieces of the arch are called voussoirs, is a French term. It's the individual pieces that make the structural arch that, of course, can span much further than we've seen in Greece, in ancient Greek architecture. Because now with arches, we have much, much larger spans. We're building with stone, brick, and of course, filled with concrete. So these are some very key, very important terminologies. The keystone, the center, of course, between the arches. In other words, there's some terminology. The interior arch is called the intrados. The outside of the arch is called the extrados. So the way they would build this is they would start building each what's called voussoirs. They would start building the voussoirs based on the location of what's called the spring point. So as a spring line, they would establish each voussoir resting on the spring. They would gradually build up each voussoir individual piece. And then, of course, the keystone is the last member that would lock the arch in place. So I'll give you a few minutes to write these down in your sketchbooks or notes. You know, this is definitely a far cry better in structure and architecture than the Greeks because they were not using arches. This is ultimately Roman architecture. Okay, so I think in this three-dimensional image, you can see the way that the Romans were actually constructing, because the arches are definitely not decorative in this ideology. They're really structural. Like I just uploaded this as an example. This is really, you know, a traditional / Tudor house, but you can see that the voussoirs and of course the brick masonry is structural, definitely not decorative. In neoclassical and modern architecture, you would see a steel beam underneath that. But for the most part, the Romans, of course, we didn't have steel back then. So they're relying on the arch construction to span as far as they possibly can. It's definitely very different than, of course, Greek space and structure. So I'm going to show two really intriguing examples of Greek structure and space versus Roman structure and space. Two really wonderful prominent buildings designed by the Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio. We're going to talk about Sebastian Serlio a little bit later, but for the most part, it's really wonderful to see Palladio doing two completely different types of space and structure. This is his Palazzo Chiericati, really based on Greek space and structure, filled with wonderful contradictions. Let's take a look at the ground floor loggia. Let's take a look at the relationship of the spacing between the columns and, of course, the triglyphs and the metopes. Again, the triglyphs are the three little wooden beams that are stylized as stone and marble. Vitruvius has a rule saying that anything more than 3 or 4 triglyphs or columns would be a structural disaster. So on the ground floor, we can see that the Doric columns are spanning no more than 2 triglyphs. So already Palladio is referencing the ancient architect Vitruvius from the 1st century AD, 1500 years before that, in his language of the spacing of the columns. And Palladio does wonderful things with the ends of the central bays in architecture. Instead of having one column, he pairs the columns as a kind of a beefy relationship that the fact that the end of the building is more significant than the other internal spacing. I just think this is an interesting corollary between the spacing of the columns and, of course, the relationship of the Doric order with the triglyphs and metopes. No more than 2 or 3 triglyphs in a span of one of the columns. A few years later, he's referencing Roman classical architecture, a wonderful language of arches, and of course, what's called the Serlian Arch. Sebastian Serlio is an architect that established the 5 orders, which you've seen earlier. So for the most part, Palladio is expanding on Serlian arches and kind of expanding that into his language of this is Basilica Vicenza, but you can clearly see that the classical orders are superimposed with the wall surface and, of course, the Roman sort of arches, which we've seen earlier in the class. So in the span of about 10 years, he's able to reference Greek space and structure and, of course, Roman space and structure. So again, Vitruvius is a first-century architect. He's really the one that established the proper spacing of the columns in between each one of, the columns in between each one of the spans or the spaces. Relationship of Greek and, of course, Roman architecture. You know, and Vitruvius was saying that it's like when columns are placed 3 diameters or more apart, the stone architraves can break. So let's kind of revisit that. So here's the architrave. Let's go back to this relationship. What I'm saying is architecture is filled with wonderful contradictions. I think what he's saying is, if you look at the Roman Doric intercolumnation on the top right hand, the image on the screen, is that there's different variations and contradictions. Because really, you were seeing at least, 3, of course, 3 triglyphs, 4 triglyphs. Anything beyond 3 or 4, we'd have to have a wooden beam. But again, we've seen in architecture that the stone and marble spans much further than that. So I think really Vitruvius was saying that the proper spacing in stone and marble is really 2 and no more than 3 triglyphs or column diameters. But it's interesting to see that there's interesting contradictions and violations in his rules. So let me go back to some of these other ones. Yeah, so you can clearly see that the triglyphs and the metopes, the relationship is that the metopes are non-structural, they're squares. And of course, the triglyphs can be proportioned based on the width and the spacing. So Vitruvius is really saying that anything more than 2 or 3 column diameters or triglyphs would be a structural failure. If you look at this, this line is really the structural beam, of course, the architrave, but if it's a structural engineer, it's relatively thin compared to some of the other beams that we've seen in history. But really, the beam is, of course, the mixture of the frieze, which incorporates the triglyphs, the metopes, and, of course, the architrave below that. So the structural beam is really this entire thing. Of course, the cornice is the decorative elements above that. I just find that's an interesting sort of contradictory relationship of the proper spacing that Vitruvius established, and of course the spacing that we see in Palladio's work, especially the upper Ionic order, which has a much wider spacing. Okay, so let's kind of talk about, I think you've heard the term Serlian Arch, Palladian Arch. There's several different motifs based on this relationship. The syntax of the columns, versus the arched order. Sebastian Shirley was, probably 20 years before Palladio, but he's really the one that canonized and ordered the 5 classical orders which we've seen earlier. Of course, Palladio expanded on these and, of course, eventually wrote the 4 books of architecture, which, of course, has all the classical orders in it. He's really the one that created what's called the Serlian Arch. And we've seen this in many different forms. This is 1st century AD, probably codified, written by Vitruvius. We see the triumphal arch, the large central arch. Of course, the hierarchy of the main central theme is taller than the 2 side aisles and the flanking arches. So Sebastian Serlio, before Palladio, created what's called the Serlian Arch, which of course is the central arch and of course the 2 rectangular flanking end bays on either side of the arch, which we can see in classical Renaissance architecture and of course neoclassical architecture. But of course it has the language that we've established for what the intradose, the extradose, the keystone, of course the voussoirs. And this is a very common theme in multiple facets of Renaissance, classical, and neoclassical architecture. So Palladio pretty much borrowed Sebastian Serlio's language and expanded on it. If you think about architects are the best thieves in the world, they steal other people's ideas. But of course, these are wonderful paradigms to kind of follow and continue with. So pretty much in any event, we still see the classical language of the architrave, the frieze, and of course the cornice emphatically explained on this Palladian arch or Serlian arch. So here is Palladio's Basilica, which ends up borrowing Serlian's language of the central arch theme, of course, with the 2 flanking side aisles on either side of the arch. Okay, I'm just going to kind of flip through some other images. I'm trying to answer some questions from the last several class periods. Our next lecture is the classical orders and terminology, which means I'm going to show you the relationship of Greek classicism versus Roman class. That's an entire lecture in itself, but we're not going to get into that today. It'll be our next lecture. But for the most part, you can see the intercolumnation spacing between the Doric order and, of course, the Corinthian order. This is, of course, Greek architecture. Of course, we're not building with arches. You can see that the spans are fairly limited because we're not using arch construction, which limits the span between the columns. I was going to show you, a lot of my other students in class were asking, this is a Greek Doric column capital, but I'm showing this because a lot of people were asking me, is the column carved out of one piece of stone? And to answer that question, this is an example of the entire column is carved out of one piece, because as you can see, the striations of the stone is all coplanar. This is actually all carved out of one piece. It's remarkable to see that you can see the entire thing. These are not individual. The capital and the shaft is all carved out of one piece, because normally the columns are separate pieces. This is one piece of stone. The shaft is another piece, but this is actually carved out of one block. Remarkable to think that they can subtract the entire mass of the column out of that one piece. This is not a very clear slide, but it's interesting that, because I like to show construction processes of the original temples. What we're looking at is triglyphs and metopes. Now, originally, the three triglyphs were really the wooden beams in the Etruscan temple. But you can see that the way that they're stylizing the stone members as these individual blocks that are connected with iron brads connecting each one of these. But it's interesting that they went to all the trouble of making it look like it's a real wooden temple carved out of stone and marble. Of course, these are individual pieces that are made to look like the Etruscan temples. But just incredible amount of labor and construction to make for one sort of classic order. This is a larger detail of the Palladian building, Palazzo Chiericati. I was going to show you that the way he pairs the columns together. It's interesting that the Ionic columns as pilasters are flat, but then when Palladio returns the corner, the Ionic volutes become 45-degree angles. And Palladio is still respecting Vitruvius's spans of really roughly about 2 or 3 triglyphs between each one of the columns. So what Vitruvius is really saying is anything beyond 3 or 4 triglyphs is really would have to be constructed as a wooden beam. Of course, in neoclassical architecture, you can do that because we're using steel, but the ancient classical Greeks and Romans would not be able to span this far, the tetratriglyph, of course, 4 triglyphs. Of course, what I was saying is in Roman architecture, we're building with arches, so the span between the columns can be much further apart. And it still has the terminology we discussed before, the architrave, the arch of all the voussoirs, and of course the keystone. Okay, we have about 20 more minutes. I'm just going to kind of revisit what we talked about. There's a lot of information. I want to make sure that everyone's clear on the language of arch construction. The main, of course, the architrave, which is the most significant beam, of course, in classical architecture, the architrave. The main difference between Greek space and Roman space is, of course, the spans in Roman architecture are much further apart because we're building with arches, not a post and lintel type of construction. Also remember, there always has to be an even number of columns and an odd number of spaces. And of course, remember that in the chart, it's showing you that the Doric order explicitly shows the triglyphs and metopes expressed on the frieze. You would not see that in Ionic, Corinthian, or composite order. Now, this is really the 5 orders after Vignola. Vignola was the one that simplified for contractors, builders, architects, and designers a very simple way to study analyze and draw the classical order, because a lot of the publications before this are very complex, difficult to follow, and a little bit too scientific for just an artist's sort of observatory eye. So the American Vignola is redrawn by William Ware, shows the classical orders as a sort of an easy way to proportion and design the classical orders. Now, these are the ones that are established by Sebastian Serli that Palladio expanded on. Sebastian Serli was before Palladio, and we've seen that Sebastian Serlio borrowed the triumphal arch as a motif for the language of course, the windows and, of course, the side lights that Palladio borrowed after Serlio introduced this as a motif. What's interesting here is, if you look at beyond the fact that this window is extraordinarily beautiful, look how thin the eaves are. That is like a thin sheet of plywood with some molding on it. It's a very, very elegant, thin relationship. But of course, the entablature of the cornice on the Palladian or Serlian arch is very thin in itself. It's interesting to see the relationship of the entablature on the window versus the entablature on the main actual house. Obviously, this is wooden construction. In stone construction, the elements are much thicker. But we can still see the voussoirs, the individual curved pieces that make for the arch. The intradose is smooth, the extradose has a profile. In other words, what Palladio is doing is he's taking the architrave details, pardon me, and then he's replicating that as a curved architrave. In other words, the arch has the same exact profile and dimension as the actual architrave here. And that is very common for all the classical orders. Okay, so we have about 15 more minutes for questions or comments. Anyone have any questions?
So we had a couple of questions in the chat box, Jay, and the first one was from Tim.
Okay.
He asked, what about the odd number of columns at the Temple of Apollo Epicurus at Versailles, or the new Hall of Casts at Notre Dame's College of Architecture by John Simpson? What rules are there in these cases?
Going back to the earlier paradigm, what was the name of that building? The first one?
The Temple of Apollo Epicurus at Versailles.
Okay. And you're saying that there is an odd number of columns? Yes, I think you.
Sorry, I'm looking at the question. Yes. What about the odd number of columns? Is what the question had stated.
That's an excellent.
Yes, he says yes.
No, that is an excellent observation. I'm glad you mentioned it, because probably those temples were not completely resolved and codified as a proper order. If you look at some of like the Temple of Hera, Apollo, and a lot of the other larger temples, is that those are before a lot of the formula was established. So they had what I'm calling these violations because they were not really using a formulaic standard. I hate to say the word template, but that's some early sort of construction types that really were not properly ordered, if that makes sense. In other words, they had liberty in making mistakes because they were not as sophisticated as some of the later Greek temples. That's a very good question. And then what was the other part of the question? Just another reference.
The new Hall of Casts at Notre Dame's College of Architecture by John Simpson.
Oh.
What rules are there in these cases?
Can I Google that for a minute? Because I'm not familiar with that one, because I'm approaching this class as a designer, not a historian. but I just want to, but it's good that we ask these really pertinent questions. So it was called, what was the name of the building again?
Oops, sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
The Hall of Casts at Notre Dame's College of Architecture. The new Hall of Casts.
You said it's the Holocaust?
Sorry, Hall of Casts.
Oh, Hall, okay. Yeah, I was thinking of a different building. Let me Google that for a minute and then I'll see if I can. Let me change my screen over. You have to bear with me. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, so I'm looking for, you're talking about the main facade? Oh, yes, hold on, let me see if I can share my screen. Hold on just a minute. The new share. Yes, it's a new year, a new share. Let me see if I can you guys see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so you're talking about the ionic columns that are in the center of the space. Hold on just a minute. Can you see this for a minute? Can you see this image?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so you're talking about the columns that are aligned with an edge, not a center. Is that right?
I'll see if, Tim, if you'd like to go in the chat or if you would like to unmute, either way to answer, that's fine.
Yes.
He says that's the one.
Okay, yeah. You know, I think, you know, structurally, the ancient Greeks had, there were structural reasons beyond the fact that you couldn't put an edge to a center. If it's on the main facade, you would have an even number of columns. But I think structurally, the Greeks, you would have to have a column just between, of course, the ridge beam, because the span is so large, the building is so tall that I think there's several different contradictions of the language that was established, if that makes sense. But that's a very good question because it is strange to see columns at the center of the space. But then again, if you look at postmodern architecture, they're deliberately putting edges to center as a way of making fun of the original classical. But you know, in this case, I think it's a structural problem or reason. But and it's interesting is that there's a balcony that huddles the septum or the center of that column. You know, I'm not sure I really can answer that right now, but that's a very interesting relationship. Yeah, it is interesting.
So another question that we had come in was from Darian, who asked, are the other columns of classical orders still spaced based off the proportions of triglyphs?
Let me go back to, and I'm not the best digital person in the world, but okay, so let's go back to, can you guys see this image?
Yes.
Okay. So could you repeat the question one more time?
Of course. Are the other columns of classical orders still spaced based off the proportions of triglyphs?
That's a good question, because originally what I was saying is the triglyphs in Doric architecture are evident on the facade. I think in terms of, let me go back to this one. Let's look at this relationship. You know, because we're looking at, you know, the Doric language of spacing. We're looking at Corinthian. Surprisingly, they left out Ionic in this diagram, but I still think in Greek architecture, to answer your question, yes, they are relatively based on the triglyphs, even if they're not expressed on the frieze. But in Greek architecture, we're still looking at the proper spacing because, of course, you really couldn't span that far in Greek architecture. Of course, only could the space become wider with the advent of Roman arches. And does that kind of interesting? Because when you look at this image, obviously the columns are much farther apart because we're using Roman arches, not Greek language of what's called posted lintel construction. So to answer your question, yes, they are loosely based on the spacing of either the diameter of the columns or, of course, the triglyphs. Even if the triglyphs are not expressed on the frieze, they're still referencing the spacing based on the triglyphs. Yeah, these are excellent questions.
We have, excuse me, one more from Ileana. She
Okay.
asks, at the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned that the entablature should always be aligned with the neck of the column. Correct me if this is not right. Do you have an image of a building with an entablature that is not aligned with the neck of the column? I can't quite visualize what you described.
Unfortunately, I do. Okay, well, so her name is Natalie.
Ileana.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll have to Google something because I want you to see this disturbing relationship because, so you can see the 5 orders image on the PowerPoint.
Yes.
So if Ileana is that her name, Ileana?
It is. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in each one of these diagrams, you can clearly see that the edge of the frieze, the architrave, is aligned to the neck of the column. Let me Google something, and I can easily Google. Because I mean, there are some really ugly relationships that we shouldn't be looking at, but I'm just gonna, hold on, let me Google something real quick. And I'm going to, okay, let's see. Okay, I want her to see this. Okay, I think I had to Google mansion hell in architecture, but I probably shouldn't have said that, but I just was trying to prove a point. Let me see if I can find an image because I've lost a lot of information last week during the big freeze. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, I'm going to try to share the screen with another image and okay, can you guys see the image on the right?
Yes.
Okay, let's take a look at the language, at the fact that they didn't understand that you can see the 3 arches on the house. Okay, you can see that what I'm calling well, there's really no frieze. It's hard to even discuss an architectural language because it's so poorly violated. As you can see, the plaster or the stucco is way beyond the edge of the neck of the columns. Not only are the columns not properly proportioned, that they're inset in the outside edge of that stucco wall. So in looking at this, you can clearly see that when you violate the edge condition of the entablature of the architrave, and of course the column's neck, it looks like you don't know what you're doing. Is she able to see this image?
I believe so. I can see it.
Yeah, but I mean, look how poorly done that this is,
Oh, she says, yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. I want to make sure my students understand. And then, well, for example, can you see this one, the premature obituary of the mid-mention? Can you see that? Well, obviously, it's the Corinthian order, but there's no frieze, no architrave, there's no entablature, there's no cornice. It, looks like a very poor attempt at creating classical architecture. And I think we have some other questions. Is that right?
I had one last one here. It was from Tim. I believe it was a follow-up maybe to the earlier question. So I'm sorry if I put it out of context a bit, but he asked, do these early experiments have any relevance to contemporary practice then?
Early experience, you mean early experience in?
I believe that was from when we were talking about the Temple of Apollo Epicurus and the Notre Dame Cast Hall and that sort of thing. But
Yeah,
feel free to correct me.
yes, that is a good question because the earlier temples like Temple of Hera, Temple of Apollo, we're looking at roughly 700 BC before, of course, first century, or I'm sorry, before 500 BC, the Parthenon, is that they were sort of clumsy structural relationships. Let me see if I can get to prove that point. Let me see if I can get a different PDF. Hold on just a minute, because that is a very good question. And okay, hold on just a second. Okay, let's look at, I think I'm making everyone dizzy with this, but this is the right lecture, is that, well, I'm sorry, I don't have that. But to answer your question, yes, because the earlier temples were very clumsily done because they didn't really understand the fact that they could maximize the structural integrity and minimize the material. So the Temple of Paestum or Hera, those columns are extremely fat because they really didn't understand, they weren't as sophisticated as builders and engineers as the Athenians did. If you can see this, can you see the image of the golden section on the Parthenon and ancient Greece? Can you see that?
Yes.
Because these columns are relatively thin. If I wish I had an image of the columns before that, at least if I have that. Oh gosh, I don't have that image, but what I'm saying is the earlier temples before this, the columns were over designed because they didn't understand, they weren't sophisticated enough to make the columns as thin as possible and maintain the structural integrity. So those early temples were really structural experiments. So to answer your questions, I would put those as relatively clumsy mistakes. And then we get to the Parthenon, which has the complete engineering marvel, the space of the column perfectly worked out, the dimension of the column, the size of things is very more carefully worked out than some of the early temples before that. Yeah.
And then we have one last question here to close it out.
Sure.
And that is, how do you determine the difference between quote unquote wonderful contradictions from illiterate interpretations?
Wonderful contradictions between illiterate interpretations. Well, I've shown you illiterate interpretations because we saw that awful house that we looked at North Dallas where the columns are not the right size. Could you say the question one more time just to make sure I answer it?
Of course. How do you determine the difference between wonderful contradictions and illiterate interpretations?
Wonderful contradictions are established by a lot of the philosophers, the theorists, the architects that are established by that practicing architects. The illiterate people are the ones that are building things based on observation, and they don't understand, and they don't care about, and they don't know the language of the classical architectural language of what I'm explaining to you in class. So you can tell the difference just visually looking at the difference of the two conditions that you just described. Like I just showed you, that awful house North Dallas is a literate interpretation based on the fact that the person had no understanding, didn't care, and it was a vulgar visual farce and an architectural misadventure. based on contradictions, which are based on, architects that have studied and practiced this for years. So the difference is you can tell based on the person that understands the language versus the person that is just building things based on observation and a certain amount of naivete. That answers the question. Because what I'm showing you in the lectures is wonderful contradictions, because we've seen that Palladio has violated the spacing of columns based on Vitruvius's language. That's not an illiterate interpretation. They already have knowledge and basis of the proper spacing of the orders. So people can violate that. But the people that are just building things based on driving around the neighborhood and seeing, well, it looks pretty and beautiful, I'm going to make that happen. They don't understand the proper language. When you look at, if you read Complexity and Contradiction by by Denise Scott Brown and Vituri, is that they understand the classical language based on its proportions, and they violate that deliberately because they already understand the language. So what we're looking at is a lot of people that are building things now really don't understand, don't care. It's just based on observation. And it's a very disturbing visual relationship that people still, they don't understand the language, and they just have no idea the proper, it's almost like the difference between, making rap music versus, classical, jazz, which has a structure, a syncopation, an order to it. If that kind of makes sense. That's a good question. I'm not sure I really answered that. I have trouble. I'm better at drawing things and verbalizing things, if that makes sense.
So it's totally understand. Thank you.
Yes. And any other questions? I think it's a little bit after 1.
That's all in the chat box for now.
Okay. Okay, so for our next lecture, we're going to be talking about the comparative orders. We're going to be explicitly discussing the difference between Greek classical architecture and Roman. In other words, we're going to be talking about Greek Doric columns versus Roman Doric, Greek versus Ionic, Roman Ionic. That'll be our next lecture. Okay, well, everyone, thanks. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next week on Tuesday.
Great. Thank you, Jay.
Okay, thank you.